victim service specialist, also with the Fairfax County Police Department. And now we'd like to hear from you. If you can please put your name and the faith community that you are representing in the chat so everyone can see who's on the call. We have a full agenda this evening. So we are going to get started with the meat of the evening. I'm going to go over the group agreements, and then I will turn it over to Brittany Vera. Our group agreements for this evening. This meeting will be recorded. Please do not record on your cell phone or any other device. Be fully present and open to learning. Listen deeply and accept one another's reality. Ask questions to better understand. Engage in dialogue. Challenge yourself. Expect to experience discomfort. These conversations may be uncomfortable for you or others in the room. Expect and accept non-closure. We will not discuss all aspects or solve domestic violence issues today. Respect confidentiality. Take the stories and leave the names. And now I will turn it over to Brittany.
Thanks, Suzette, and thank you for having me. I am here with Casey and Amanda. We're here to present on domestic violence as part of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which happens in October. As we get started, I'm going to ask you, Caroline just dropped in the chat a quick SurveyMonkey link. I promise it's not graded, it's not painful, it's quick, it's easy, hopefully. And our division is really big on trying to evaluate if we're accomplishing what we set out to accomplish as part of our training offering. So we would really appreciate you just taking that quick 4 or 5 question pre-test, and then we'll give you a chance to do a knowledge check at the end of our time together. So as Suzette said, my name is Brittany Vera. I am the Child Witness to Violence, Domestic Violence Coordinator within the Department of Family Services and Domestic and Sexual Violence Services. And I'm here today to present a very broad overview of domestic violence, what it looks like. We'll talk a little bit, Suzette, next slide, if you don't mind, or Ramona, a little bit about how it impacts children. And then we're going to spend some time identifying how clergy can respond to congregants who might be experiencing DV. I know that not everyone on this call is a clergy member, but perhaps you're a lay leader within your house of worship. And so hopefully you'll find this to be helpful and applicable to you too. All right, so we're going to start out and back up a couple slides. One slide, there we go. We're going to start out by talking about a definition, and I will just say, if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I will get to them if I'm not going to address it later, or I might ask you to connect with me offline about it, or I might be addressing it later in the presentation. Before we begin, I do want to say that today we're going to be talking about domestic violence and what it looks like in relationships. And when we talk about domestic violence, we always talk about all the different ways it can show up. We call it manifestations. There's a lot of different ways that can look, as you're going to find out, but today we're going to spend more time talking about what it looks like when people use religion and spirituality to cause harm. And that's especially important because of the role that you have to play in disrupting its use. So we're not talking about religion being bad in and of itself. We know that religion is something that is a powerful force in a lot of people's lives, and it can bring about a lot of healing to us individually and as a community and as a world. And also we know that there are a lot of good and wonderful things in the world that can be twisted and used to cause harm. And unfortunately, religion and spirituality can be one of them. So the things that we're going to discuss today are misrepresentations that are unfortunately common across all religions and not specific to any one religion. And they are not true reflections of the religion. So this is about how individuals misrepresent religious beliefs and cause harm to family members. And again, this is a very nuanced topic, and we're going to try to do it justice in the time that we have tonight. I saw in the chat that there was a question about not being able to select all the right answers. Pick your favorite. Sorry about that. I'll know what you mean. So my apologies. All right. So we're going to start with a brief definition of domestic violence. When we think about domestic violence, what we're thinking about is a pattern of coercive behaviors that are used by an individual to gain or maintain power and control over another individual in the context of an intimate relationship. This could be two people who live together or don't and are just dating. It could be two people who have a child in common. Maybe they were married, maybe they were never married, or they had a one-night stand that resulted in the birth of a child. I've had that happen in my career. I'm sure Casey and Amanda have as well. And so what we're ultimately talking about is a relationship that looks like this, where one person has power in the relationship and the other person is subject to the power. Next slide, please. And so what happens in this relationship is that the person in power really creates a power differential and shapes the interactions between outsiders and the family. They control the narrative of what's true for the family to the outside world and within the family. Offenders or people who use violence often see themselves as a rule maker or enforcer, and they believe for a lot of different reasons that they deserve to be in control. And survivors often face consequences, which can be lethal or fatal if they try to challenge the rule maker. And there's this element of entrapment. You can't leave without punishment. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like. Next slide, please. So these are the different forms of power and control. I'm going to talk very, very briefly about each of these, and we'll spend a little bit more time on a couple of them because they're a little bit more relevant to us. Next slide. So when we think about physical abuse, a lot of these things don't come as any real surprise. And I'm going to kind of, as we go through these, call out the ones that might not be the first thing on your mind. Using mobility aids or controlling access to medication is something that we don't often hear of, but does happen. If someone might be insulin dependent, or they need to take a medication for their asthma, or even a mental health disorder, and you have someone in the relationship who's controlling the victim's access to that, that can be a really serious threat to their physical safety. Next slide. And I'm going to come back to stalking at the end kind of this discussion, and you'll understand why in a minute. I want to emphasize that not all relationships have a component of physical violence. There's a lot of relationships that never become physical because the threat of the physical harm is enough to kind of keep the dynamics where the offender might want them. What is common in almost every single relationship where there's domestic violence is emotional and psychological abuse. If you can click through, Ramona, please. So when we think of emotional and psychological abuse, it's kind of goes hand in hand with verbal abuse, which is on the next slide. Think about, isolation is a really big thing. Isolation from resources, friends, family members. That's a very, very common thing to experience in domestic violence. Harming pets or service animals. Casey and Amanda's team just had a whole canine crawl devoted to raising awareness of the link between the abuse of pets and the abuse of people in an intimate relationship. The thing I'll highlight here is gaslighting, which is something that's becoming more and more mainstream. Gaslighting is essentially trying to alter someone's view of reality. I once had a colleague who worked with a survivor who was gaslit to such a serious degree, she thought she was experiencing early onset Alzheimer's. And as my friend worked with her, she realized there's a lot of things that she remembered about her abuse and a lot of details. She could remember, she had access to short-term and long-term memory. And what it was her partner gaslighting her and doing things like taking her birth control pills and saying, why can't you keep track of this? You keep spending more and more money on these birth control pills. Why can't you figure this out, right? Or moving her keys and calling her names for being so forgetful that she couldn't find her keys. So this can look a lot of different ways. Next slide. Verbal abuse is also pretty frequent and common. It can encapsulate a whole bunch of different things. One thing that we don't often think of is threatening self-harm or suicide. That could probably fall into a couple categories, but that's something whenever we hear that from a survivor, our antennas start to go up and we start to think about the lethality of the situation and how quickly this could really kind of turn deadly in some cases. Next slide. Sexual violence is something that occurs on a continuum, and we don't often think of this as a part of domestic violence, but it very much is. At one end of the spectrum, you have sexual harassment, which might include unwanted jokes or sexual comments. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have completed rape. But this could also include things like controlling pregnancy outcomes, birth control sabotage, incapacitation with drugs or alcohol. There's also a real cultural component that goes into sexual violence. There's people from some cultures and communities that might think that they're not able to say no to their partner because they're married. And the important thing to recognize here is that cooperation does not mean consent. There's a lot of people who cooperate with sexual violence to keep things from turning even more physically violent, or perhaps to cooperate with protecting family members or other individuals. Before I worked in my current job, I used to work in our supervised visitation program housed within the courts. And my entire caseload consisted of people who were experiencing domestic violence in their relationships. And we once had a woman who had separated from her abusive partner, but he was still forcing her to have sex every time they would trade custody of the child. And she couldn't take custody of the child without having sex with him. So sexual violence can look a lot of different ways. Next slide. Financial abuse is one that's fairly well known. It's something that often keeps survivors in relationships that they would rather leave because they feel that they wouldn't be able to support themselves outside of the relationship. But it's something that can also extend after the relationship ends, such as not paying bills that the court has ordered payment on, not paying spousal support or child support, forcing the victim to take time off of work, to file a contempt order, to take them back to court, and it just keeps on delaying everything. So this is one that, again, can look a lot of different ways, and we hear a lot of different iterations of it. Forcing work outside the home. Sorry, I was just going to go back and kind of highlight a couple of these. Identity theft is not often one we think about, but it's one that's very easy to kind of perpetrate if your partner knows everything about you and might know all of the answers to the different like those secret questions that you're supposed to answer to kind of manage security settings. So when we work with survivors around this, we tell them that their favorite food is now blue and their favorite color is now pizza, as a way to kind of manage that. Next slide. Culture and identity is another one that kind of touches a lot of different pieces of who we are as individuals. Isolation from cultural communities can be a big one for a lot of different reasons, and we're going to touch on this when we talk about immigrant communities. But there's this feeling of people aren't going to believe me in my community because maybe this happens to a lot of us, right? And we're just supposed to go along with what's happening. So using cultural norms to justify abuse, or there's forced immersion into a cultural community. Withholding identity documents, such as not allowing someone to apply for citizenship or not supporting their application as a way to kind of keep the person in the abusive relationship. If people aren't familiar with what it means to dead name or use incorrect pronouns, dead naming refers to calling someone by a previous name that they were given at birth. That person is now transgender and they identify in the world as a different gender from what they were born, and they use a different name. So dead naming means using their own name. And think about like if this person were to travel to the rural South where they presented very clearly as feminine, people might not know them, and they were in a very small community. And let's just say their partner called out their name across the grocery store, and all of a sudden they're now outed in this community where people don't know them and they feel threatened. So that's another way to kind of use power and control. Next slide. So religious or spiritual abuse, this is where we'll spend a little bit more time than the other slides. Essentially, what this is forcing someone to choose their safety over following spiritual beliefs. And I'll give you a really good example to illustrate this. My favorite colleague, who worked with a lot of different survivors with a lot of different experiences, had a family that she was working with. The survivor was Jewish and they observed the Sabbath. And so as part of their kind of routine and rituals for the Sabbath, they would go through their home and they would turn off the lights in the bedroom so they could sleep at night, and they would turn on lights in the common areas so they would, have light at nighttime, because if they flipped a light switch, it was doing work. They would prepare meals in advance so that they could kind of eat them and prepare them like according to their beliefs. And right after sundown on Friday, when the Sabbath started, this woman's abuser would go through the home, turn the lights on in the bedrooms, and throw out all of the food that she has prepared. And so when her children were hungry and wanted something to eat, he would berate and ridicule her and say, "Why can't you just be a good mother and fix something to eat for your children? Why don't you just turn off the lights so that they can go to sleep?" And so this woman was put in the position of feeling like she had to violate her spiritual beliefs in order to keep her family safe and take care of them. So that's just one example. Religious and spiritual abuse could also look like preventing the practice of religious or spiritual beliefs, or forcing someone to practice beliefs in which they don't believe themselves, right? Maybe it's, my partner and I had a decision before we got married that we were each going to practice our separate religions, but then after the marriage, I was forced to practice a religion in which I don't believe. Or maybe the same conversation applied to children, right? And all of a sudden the rules of the game have changed. Remember, the abuser is the one kind of setting the rules and kind of running the plays. Sometimes you might see the misuse of religious beliefs or texts to justify abusive behavior, or blaming abuse on a lack of faith or belief on the part of the victim. Sometimes we also see that people use beliefs about different roles that family members have within the family according to their belief system to cause harm to other family members. So if you have a belief about who should be the head of the household and what that means, that could be something that's used to harm instead of protect. Next slide. I want to also take a few more minutes to talk about what domestic violence can look like for immigrant families, because we know that Fairfax County is home to over 100 different languages and people from a wide variety of different countries that have their own beliefs and different religions that they practice. Culture is always specific. Even people, who are Caucasian from the United States, who might live next door to each other, who are from the same town, have different cultures and belief systems. So we have to recognize that and hold on to that as we think about what this looks like for immigrant families. Oftentimes what you see is a controlling narrative of the immigration process. I had a client one time who told me that she was brought here when she was 16 years old, kind of mostly against her will, but they faked her immigration papers to make it look like she was 18. And then she was locked in her home and she had to watch cartoons. Yep, she had to watch cartoons to learn English. There's often a fear of losing custody to children, maybe due to CPS involvement or immigration status, a lack of economic resources, or the threat of international parental kidnapping. Maybe there's a fear of deportation for oneself, or even threats against family members in victims' country of origin, which is not unique or kind of an isolated thing. It happens a lot, especially if people are from the same town and they're from the same community, and there might be a high level of gang violence. And often language barriers keep people from accessing services. Next slide. There's also a fear about the police and courts, or even just how systems work. I had one client who at one point believed that the fact that her children were involved in a supervised visitation program was going to follow them all the way to college. She said, how is this going to impact their ability to get into college? She was from a former Soviet Union country. And I said, nope, that's not how this works. And we had to do a little bit of education around that. Again, those cultural norms from a country of origin, I might not like what's happening to me. I might find it abusive and harmful, but if my mother went through it and my sister is going through it and my grandmother experienced it, it has to be the same for me, and there's not a whole lot I can do to change it. There's a lack of knowledge about available resources or eligibility for resources. And there's often additional trauma surrounding an immigration journey, depending on how people arrived in the country. So when we think about technology, if you remember when the internet started back in the 90s, some people remember, some people don't. I try to forget, but we used to think of cyber stalking, right? And so cyber stalking was this big thing. And now what we think of this is as the use of technology to cause harm and perpetrate violence. In almost every different kind of form of abuse that I've talked about, there was the opportunity for technology to be involved. So this can look a lot of different ways. It could be degrading text messages. It could be violating a protective order with electronic communication, demanding that people change passwords with or without permission, or controlling social media accounts. Putting GPS devices in vehicles. I once had a mother put a GPS device in an Elsa doll and say that the doll couldn't go anywhere without the child. And all of a sudden Elsa's talking and it's the mother's voice coming through the doll. And she was, stalking and controlling the partner. Threatening to use social media against the partner, using call or text spoofing apps to kind of call a phone incessantly just to hang up. And now with the use of smart devices within the home or in a car, there's ways to control the temperature of a home, or to lock and unlock doors and lock people out of houses to control the physical environment. So there's a lot of different ways this can show up. All right, next slide. I promised I was going to come back to stalking, and Amanda or Casey, if you want to jump in here at any point, please do. But when we think about stalking, this is not necessarily the legal definition of stalking, but we think of stalking as a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would put a reasonable person in fear for their safety. So this reasonable person standard is not really objective. It's about what the average person with all of the information about what happened in the relationship, would they find that scary? So if I had a partner who was physically abusive towards me and threatened to kill me and said, if you ever try to leave me, I'm going to send your mother flowers the day before I kill you. Right. And all of a sudden I get a phone call from my mom saying, I just got the most beautiful bunch of flowers at my door, but it's a really weird note. It says, you're going to know what to use these for. Right. And I'm freaking out at work, and all of my coworkers are like, Brittany, come on, it's just flowers. If they knew what I knew, they would also probably be afraid, right? And so this communication between the stalker and the victim has very specific meaning and intent. It's only understood between those two individuals. I highlight stalking because this is something that takes place either during the relationship or after the relationship might end. And it's a situation in which systems are often used to continue to stalk. It could like calling child protective services on a person. It could look like taking them to court constantly so they can see them in court all the time and try to figure out what kind of car they drive, if they've gotten a new car, or who's coming with them. But it could also include using religious institutions. And this is something that can happen very easily because people trust clergy, and they don't kind of think anything of a clergy member maybe calling them up and say, hey, your husband's really worried about you. He said that you left them, and, he's really worried about your health and well-being. And is there anything that I can tell him so that, he's not so worried about you? And I really think you need to come back to your marriage, right? Not saying that anyone on this call would do that, but it's very easy to kind of get sucked into accidentally perpetrating and kind of continuing these behaviors and being kind of colluding in the battering. And so we really want to think about, if someone were to come up to you and ask questions or say, my partner left me and I'm really worried about them, and I need you to get information about where they are and what happened and where they're living now, that should raise a couple red flags for you about how you go about making that phone call, or if you go about making that phone call. And the same can be said of friends and family members. So I'll pause here really quickly in case there's any questions. I don't see any in the chat, but please don't hesitate to pop them in there if you do have them. So let's think about what this looks like over time. Next slide, please. So what this looks like is I've made it sound really, really bad and like it's bad all the time. And that's not necessarily the case. These relationships often start out as the best relationship someone has ever had. They feel really safe in the relationship. Their partner treats them like a king or a queen. And it's what we call hearts and flowers. But slowly over time, things start to shift. And Ramon, if you could go to the next slide, and then I'm going to ask you to go backwards back to this slide again. Oops. What happens is that things slowly begin to shift, and it's kind of like a frog in a pot of boiling water. The abuser starts to define reality and tell the survivor what they can and can't do, or starts to blame the survivor for things. They erode the survivor's sense of self-esteem, and the isolation increases. If things haven't become violent at some point, they're more likely to become violent as the relationship goes on. They become more severe in nature. And at some point, there is an increased risk for illness, injury, or death. So Ramona, if you could back up one slide now. And so what we see in relationships is at the top of the peak, it's not just violence, it's an incident of power and control. It could look like someone cleaning a gun and putting the bullets in front of the victim, or dropping a pile of bullets in her lap after he's cleaned the gun. It could look like cutting off access to finances. It could look like a lot of different things. It's not always violent. And then afterwards, there's either remorse on the part of the offender, or they blame the victim for their actions. And they say, if you had just done what I asked you to do, I wouldn't have had to do those things that you say made you so afraid. And then things might go back to kind of hearts and flowers. And, you know, that was an aberration. I can explain that away. And it kind of falls into this period where it's the same old stuff. But eventually tension starts to build again. Everyone in the family is trying to make the offender happy, but eventually there's another incident of power and control. And that's how the cycle continues. Next slide. And so it's really important that we recognize that the most dangerous moment, you can go forward. The most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship is when the survivor decides to leave. We have to kind of move away from this notion that we always create safety when the survivor leaves, because we are also creating a lot of danger. We might put them in a safe place, like a domestic violence shelter, or in an apartment somewhere where the offender doesn't have access to them. But because you have taken the dynamics of the relationship and done this, the offender is now feeling out of control, and it could cause them to escalate in the severity of what they're doing. Next slide. So we want to recognize that there's a lot of different barriers. You can go ahead and click through, Ramona. I forgot to take the animation off, sorry. There's a lot of barriers that keep survivors in abusive relationships. It's fear, it's isolation, it's beliefs about what children need in a family. It's a hope that things are going to work out. It's a sense of I'm not going to be believed in the community, regardless of what community means. There's the economic factor and the legal situation, right? Because what happens if the court gives him custody because he looks like the better parent, right? If I have, anxiety and depression, and I'm using substances to manage kind of day to day because I'm overwhelmed by my life and I'm experiencing trauma, that could be a very real, unfortunate fear. So we really need to ask ourselves, why don't people who use violence stop using violence, instead of why do survivors stay in relationships that are harmful and abusive? Or why don't they just leave? Sorry, would be the better question that we shouldn't ask. Next slide. So I want to kind of think through these examples, and this is the part where the audience gets to participate. You can drop in the chat kind of what you're hearing that might concern you about this situation, and at what point you would be concerned about whether or not there's domestic violence happening between or in the families with the examples that I'm giving. We're going to have one now and then two a little bit later. So in this example, there's an older couple in your house of worship that are longtime attenders. They come to every service and participate in a lot of the activities that your house of worship offers. There's never seemed to be any animosity between them in public or anything that you've heard of from either of them in private. And one day, you're taking up a collection for a holiday present for one of the clergy on staff. And the wife approaches you and says she wants to donate, but she has to get the money from her husband because he keeps track of it. So does that raise any red flags? Next slide. And she asks you to come with her to get the money from your husband. And she asks him for the money, but her husband says, remind me what this is for again. And the wife patiently explains, but you see a quick look of annoyance cross the husband's face. So now at this point, are you thinking, there's something up, or is this pretty normal for them, right? You never really know. Now, weeks later, the wife approaches you and asks you to pray for her daughter, who's in a very abusive and harmful marriage. The wife feels flummoxed as to what to tell her daughter, as she wants her to be safe, but she and her husband believe their daughter should stay in the marriage for the children and the commitment she made to God. And she also wants her to be safe. So now what are you thinking? Are you still thinking everything's fine here? Or are you starting to think about how domestic violence can transmit from one generation to the next because of learned patterns of behavior? Next slide. So a couple months go by and you invite the wife out to lunch as part of the women's ministry. The wife expresses interest, but then seems doubtful she will be able to join. She says that her husband has to drive her and she doubts he will want to wait for her in the car during lunch. She politely declines the invitation. So all of these different pieces of the scenario separately might not raise any concern or any alarm bells for you. But if you put it all together, it's very easy to think, I really need to start to pay attention for what's happening here. And maybe there's some things that I need to ask, or I need to pay attention for opportunities to kind of intervene and try to figure out how to support this couple, right? This is a real example. I won't say where the example came from, but it's a real example, and I really didn't change much about it. So this is what it shows up as in your houses of worship. Next slide. So again, I'll pause here for just a minute before I kind of move into the next section. We're going to talk very briefly about domestic violence and its impact on children. These could be whole trainings that are, a couple hours long. And in fact, we're going to have a training on these topics this weekend, actually, for a training opportunity that we have open to the community. So if this is feeling interesting or you're curious and want to learn more, I'd be happy to connect with you offline.
And if anyone has any questions, you can speak up or maybe raise your hand. I'm not sure, because we're sharing the screen, that we can see all of your faces. So feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand or put it in the chat if you have a question or comment.
All right, so we'll move on to talking about domestic violence and its impact on children. Until probably, I would say maybe last 10 to 15 years, we had this idea in our culture that what children didn't know didn't hurt them. And we now know, because of research and science, that is just not true. And I'm sure you've probably heard information about trauma and its impact on children and how it affects them for the rest of their life. So think back to those conversations that you've had and kind of apply this here. Children can witness domestic violence in a lot of different ways, not just by actually seeing it happen in front of them. Next slide. They might hear the violence. They might feel the violence. That quote of "every time the floor moves, mommy's getting hit" is a real quote from a child whose family was involved in child protective services. They are used in the violence, or they participate in the violence. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. Maybe they try to intervene to protect, or they have to deal with the aftermath. And dealing with the aftermath doesn't just mean maybe helping a parent cover up the bruises with makeup, but it's also dealing with the fallout of the emotions that the victim might be having. They're angry, they're afraid, they don't know what to do, and the child is seeing all of that unfold. Next slide. When I was in my supervised visitation program, we would ask a lot of questions. If you can back up, please, Ramona. We would ask a lot of questions about what children's experiences of the abuse were in the family. And almost every single parent reported that at one point in time, the children had been used as a pawn. I think there were maybe 5 to 6 exceptions to this, where the offender would threaten to take the children away from the mother and flee to the home country. In some cases, they would threaten to abuse children if the victim didn't comply with what they wanted them to do, or they would make false accusations of child abuse or neglect towards the victim. They also demean the victim as a parent, not in all cases, but in some cases. Sometimes they do it in front of the children. And so it really kind of knocks the parent off that authority pedestal in the children's eyes. They might outright tell the children not to listen to the victim, that she doesn't care about them, or that they're not going to protect them. In some very severe cases, offenders are actually attempting to gain the allegiance of children. And this happens because the children believe that the offender is the one who can protect them and the victim cannot. They might use them to spy on the victim, to participate in the abuse by calling the victim names or refusing to accept her authority, or to tell the victim that to tell the children that the victim is at fault for the abuse. And so this creates an environment in which the child has a really conflicted relationship. And I've seen this happen in children as young as 2 years old, where they're with mom all day and they're sitting in her lap and she's doing things with them and they're having fun together. But then as soon as the father's car pulls into the driveway, the 2-year-old is running away from mom, screaming, "Don't hurt me, don't hurt me, don't hurt me." Right? And that's at 2. And in about 30 to 60% of cases, we know that children become direct victims of abuse themselves. It's a way to torture the victim and really to instill fear and domination over the entire family. Next question. And I want to emphasize, this doesn't happen in every single family, but in most families, as we're going to talk about in a few minutes, children are aware of what's happening in the relationship. If the victim has to learn how to survive and kind of swim in the water that they're living in and figure out where the safe spots are and where the good hiding spots are, so do children. They have to navigate the same waters. So we know there is also a connection between domestic violence, other traumas that children experience, and health outcomes later in life. You've probably heard at some point about the ACE study. If you're connected to neighborhood and community services in any capacity, this is one of their favorite things to talk about, and they do a great job. So I'm going to touch on it very briefly. But the Adverse Childhood Experience Study was a study that connected the trauma that children experienced early on in life to negative health outcomes that they had as adults. And it seems like a weird through line, but it exists because when children experience trauma that goes unaddressed, they have to develop ways to cope with that trauma. And what that can look like is kind of these adaptations that don't seem very adaptive as adults, where they learn to shut off emotions. They might use substances or like drugs or alcohol to cope. They might run away or not go to school. And so they become underemployed or unemployed. It leads to more disease, disability, and social problems. And all of a sudden they've got lung cancer or diabetes or chronic heart disease, things that we wouldn't necessarily think of that are connected to these traumas that children experience early on in life. And what this study found was that the more frequently children witnessed violence towards a parent, the more likely they were to experience every other childhood adversity that was measured and studied during the ACE study. So they were more likely to have a parent who was addicted to drugs or alcohol. They were more likely to experience abuse or neglect in other forms. They were more likely to have a parent who was had a mental illness or who was going to be arrested. And they even measured separation and divorce as a childhood adversity. So it's easy to see how once domestic violence happens, it puts them at risk for everything else, because a lot of those things happen for families. And what this study found was that children who experienced 4 or more of these adversities were more likely to have a decreased life expectancy as adults due to these chronic health conditions. Or conditions that seem to have no connection whatsoever until now to trauma. If you're interested in that, we can do a whole training on ACEs and childhood adversity and trauma. Next slide. So when we think about children and domestic violence, we're not talking about a small number of children. By the time they turn 17, one study estimates that 1 in 4 American children are going to experience or witness violence between their parents. That's 20.5 million children. If you think about how many children there are in your house of worship, that becomes a very real number. And in about 30 to 60% of cases where there was DV, there was also child abuse. I will just take a minute to say right here that clergy and people who work in houses of worship with children are mandated reporters. And if you suspect abuse or neglect, you're obligated by the Code of Virginia to call the CPS hotline, the Child Protective Services hotline. It's not your job to figure out if the abuse is happening. You just have to call and report what you know. This study also highlighted that about 90% of children actually saw the violence as opposed to hearing it or experiencing in some indirect form. It was interesting because this study kind of surveyed parents and then they surveyed the children of the parents. And when they asked parents if their child had directly witnessed the domestic violence, only about 36% of parents said yes. And 77% of their children said, yes, we've actually seen this play out. And I don't have any hard data, but anecdotally, I can say the same is true in Fairfax County. When I worked in supervised visitation, very few parents said that their kids witnessed the abuse. And when we talked to the kids who were old enough to understand, they're like, oh yeah, I saw that happen. And so a lot of times we might wonder why there's such a big disconnect. But if I, as a parent, can kind of keep all of the plates spinning that I have to manage as a survivor between keeping my partner happy so that the violence doesn't escalate or the abuse doesn't escalate, making sure my children get to soccer practice, keeping up with work obligations and running carpool, it's much easier for me to manage all of that if I don't think about my kids witnessing what's happening. Maybe I'm just unaware because I'm too busy trying to survive the moment when the violence does reach a boiling point, right? And what we hear is a lot of parents, once they recognize that their children are being impacted, they want to make a change to try to keep their children safe. Next slide. So let's think about this in terms of what you might see, what you might hear, and how this impacts kids. Anytime you have a sudden unexplained change in behavior with a child, that's your first clue that there's something going on. Doesn't mean there's domestic violence every time, but it means that there's something happening for the family. Maybe there's been a death in the extended family. Maybe the kids are attending a new school or something, some kind of life stressor. And so really it's about putting all of these puzzle pieces together. Maybe there's very irregular and sporadic attendance after a lot of consistent attendance at your house of worship. There's aggression or bullying towards peers. Maybe you've got a 4 or 5-year-old that was potty trained and is all of a sudden wetting their pants. Maybe they have difficulty paying attention or not being able to sit still, or they're running away from home. Or maybe there is this real rigidity to following spiritual practices and believing if they don't do it exactly right, things are not going to be okay. Maybe you notice they don't listen to one parent or another, or they kind of over or underreact to what's happening around them, right? A very loud, sudden, big noise doesn't really set them off the way it might other kids. And so their fight or flight reactions are confused. Next slide. What you might hear from kids is a fear of getting into trouble for misbehavior, right? I work with kids in my house of worship, and when I was much younger and didn't have as many resources as I do now, I would often say, do you want me to go get your parent, or do you want to do what I'm asking you to do, right? Not the best thing to say, but I was like 15 years old. And how do kids react to that, right? How do kids react when they do something bad and they know they've messed up? Is there like forgiveness and relief, or is there this unshakable fear of getting in trouble? Are they articulating feeling sad or depressed? Are they exhibiting that behavior? Is there a lot of unexplained worry or worries about safety for themselves and their parent that maybe they can't explain, right? But they just have a lot of worries and a lot of fears. Maybe they express feeling bad when they've done nothing wrong, or maybe there's shame and embarrassment. Or there's anger towards others, right? There's this misplaced anger because they can't be angry at a parent for what's happening. You might even see resentment towards siblings, especially if one sibling is favored over the other, right? There's some cultures where genders are treated differently, right? I had a family one time where the dad had an older son who was like 3 or 4 and the daughter was an infant. And as he was changing the daughter's diaper, he was kind of saying like shame, shame, shame to her and like wagging his finger at her diaper area. And we had to have a conversation about what kind of messages that he was sending to his daughter as she got older. The same dad would often take toys out of the little girl's hands and put them in the older boy's hands if he expressed wanting them, right? And so we had another conversation about what that teaches his daughter. And so just kind of noticing what's showing up for kids. Next slide. So what's happening for a kid, right? The impact of the trauma is literally changing their brain and the way they process information and respond to other people, and also how they form relationships. All of their fight, flight, freeze, or feign death reactions are becoming confused. And because home is not a safe place, and their experiences are not validated and their needs are not recognized, it's not a safe place to have emotions. It's not a safe place to learn how to manage emotions. So you might see some kids that are just really emotionally shut down. Their relationship to parents and caregivers can be disrupted, and social and emotional development is also disrupted. All right, so let's talk again about what this can look like. Again, these are real life examples, not saying where they came from, but they exist in Fairfax County. So you have a new family that starts attending your church. There's 2 young children, an older boy, let's say he's like 5 or 6, and a younger girl, maybe she's 2 or 3. And the father's in the military, and you work with the children in the children's programming. So one day during Sunday school, the boy wouldn't keep his hands off his sister. And when you ask him to keep his hands to himself and focus on the lesson, he says, "She's my sister. I can do whatever I want to her." And so you think, okay. And you start to pay more attention and observe what's happening for the family. And you notice that the parents often sit further apart than most couples during the service. And I'll add that oftentimes the children are between them. And during the service, the children are often climbing all over the father, but interact very minimally with the mother. Next slide. So again, thinking about what's concerning and what would set your antenna off here, right? One day during the service, the family sits a couple rows ahead of you. And during one of the scripture readings, you see the younger daughter start to get antsy and squirmy. The father leans over with a harsh look in his eyes, and you see him mouth the words, "Behave or I will beat your butt." The girl immediately goes still. And then minutes later, she's asking the father to pick her up and hold her. Minutes later, the son does something that causes the father to drag him out of the sanctuary. You later hear from another children's minister, the father took the child outside and was yelling at him. So at what point, backing up to that other slide, at what point do you start to become concerned? At what point do you say something to someone? What's concerning about this, right? Oftentimes we don't always have enough information to act, or we feel really flummoxed about how to go about doing this. And this particular example presents a concern because the couple doesn't have a really long history or relationship with the clergy or the church, right? And so sometimes that can make it harder to intervene. I'll just pause here. Does anyone have any thoughts on what you might do, or what you're curious about, or how you would go about addressing this? No, it's 8 o'clock on a Friday, feels like a Friday night. It's been a long month for some of us. Okay, so we'll move on.
I would say, Brittany, do you want me to stop sharing so you can see people?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
We'll keep going. Trying to read the room. All right, so next slide. Oops. So our last example, one day a mother with 3 children approaches you frantic with tears in her eyes during the services. So you take her to a quiet room and she proceeds to tell you her husband is tracking everything he can about her and trying to make her out to be a horrible, crazy parent. Her oldest 2 children don't want to talk to her anymore, and she's frantic, teary, and upset. She says that she can't even find all the spyware that is on her computer and cell phone. She can't make phone calls, send emails, or texts without her husband knowing. You know her husband and you've had extensive contact with her children and have even been in their home without the slightest indication that something was wrong. What do you do? So this is another example of how you have an offender, possible offender, who's trying to control an outside narrative just by trying to look like a really good guy who coaches his kids' sports teams, who goes to church every Sunday, who doesn't give you the slightest indication that something might be wrong, right? But we can't always rely on the behavior or lack of kind of indicators from someone using violence in order to really kind of gauge what's actually happening for the family. So next slide, let's talk about how we can respond. We always want to start with believing survivors and victims. Next slide, Ramona. People rarely make false reports about domestic and sexual violence because of the shame and stigma that it can bring. If you can back up one slide, Ramona, please. Because of the shame and stigma surrounding it. And oftentimes in certain communities, there's this increased concern of, will I be believed? It's really important that we are willing to take the side of safety. Sometimes it can feel like we're caught in this untenable situation when we know both parties to think, who should we believe, right? And we have to be willing to take the side of safety, as I say. You can ask how to help meet basic needs for the survivor. You can also ask the victim if you can call our domestic and sexual violence 24-hour hotline together to gather information and resources and try to do some safety planning. As we've just identified, it's important to find safe methods of communication with the victim. Don't assume that it's safe to leave a voicemail or send a text message without explicitly asking permission to do so. Maybe you know of other clergy or professionals who've supported victims and do a really good job, and you want to ask their advice. There used to be a pastor at a local church. His name was Pastor Bruce, and he used to lead our DV committee of the Faith Communities in Action, and he was a fantastic resource until he retired. Some of you might remember him. Next slide. You can ask the victim to identify safe people in your house of worship with whom they can connect. Again, as I mentioned earlier, being aware that family and friends might be unknowingly participating in the abuse, and establish a safety plan for the victim and child when they're at your house of worship. Have you thought through, and do you have a policy in place if there's a protective order and one party is not allowed within a certain distance? Is it safe to even have them in the building? Think about how you can connect the victim to other DV organizations for additional support and services. Don't feel like you have to do it all and operate in isolation. There's a lot of resources here in the community to help and support you. You can coordinate with a local police station, especially if there's a protective order, right? At my house of worship, we have a police car sitting in the parking lot every Sunday, because we've unfortunately had threats to our building safety and security, right? And so if we have a situation where there's a protective order, we're walking out to that police cruiser every Sunday morning and letting them know what's going on for the people in our house of worship. And it's also important to hold those who use violence accountable for their behavior while also being mindful of the possible impact on the victim's safety. That's not something that you want to do without either first consulting a professional or talking about with the victim if that's something that they want you to do and how to go about doing it, because chances are it could be impacting the survivor's safety. The things that we want to avoid, that we don't want to do. I'm sure no one on this call would ever do these things, but tell your friends or tell other people you know. We never want to minimize the abuse, nor do we want to use religious texts to condone the actions of the person using violence. We want to be able to let the victim lead the way and kind of lead us when they're ready to talk about forgiving the abuser, if that's something that they even want to do. And as I mentioned a minute ago, don't reach out to the offender without the permission from the survivor and a safety plan in place. And it can be especially helpful to be prepared to have examples from religious texts that support the safety and autonomy of women and partners of all genders to live safely and without fear. So let's talk about the unique opportunities that houses of worship and clergy have to kind of speak out against domestic violence. Creating a safe space in your house of worship is one of the best and most important things you can do. teaching through life cycle events, weddings, baptisms, bat mitzvahs, bar mitzvahs, funerals, using it as an opportunity to observe family dynamics and identify if there could be a need for resources or a way to connect with someone if there's something concerning that you see. Educate your community. Get people on your staff trained and make it a priority to think about how you're going to respond to this. As I mentioned already, work is part of a team. We have a well-oiled, coordinated community response to domestic violence within Fairfax County. At one point, we had someone from Faith Communities in Action who sat on our Council to End Domestic Violence, Rabbi Amy. And so there's a larger community here to support you. Next slide. Oops. We talked about getting training on domestic and sexual violence, using your prophetic voice. What that means is using what opportunities you have during services to educate or to speak out against domestic violence. I know that some temples will, during Domestic Violence Awareness Month, will have what's called a Speak Out Sabbath, where they preach about domestic violence and the importance of safety in the home for everyone. Making sure that teachers and youth group leaders receive training about how to recognize abuse and who to approach with concerns. You can also include age-appropriate programming about bullying and teen dating violence for your youth. And as I mentioned earlier, have an action plan in place, policies, programs, and procedures to help families if there are concerns about domestic violence. Next slide. All right, so as I mentioned, we have a ton of resources here in Fairfax County. If you can back up one, please, Ramona. The first resource I want to give you is our office's information. We have a 24-hour hotline. And while you might think of this as a phone line for victims, it is, but it is just as much of a resource for you as professionals. If you have questions about how to support someone or what to do because you're just not sure, you can call and get information from this hotline. We can provide safety planning. We can help you think through safety planning. We provide referrals to emergency shelter for high lethality cases. And we also provide access to services within our organization for victim advocacy and counseling for children and adult victims. And we also run a state certified family violence intervention program. That is the only thing within our services that is has a fee attached to it. You're going to hear from Casey and Amanda talk about the Victim Services Division and the role of the domestic violence detectives within the Major Crimes Bureau in just a minute. So I'm going to let them go over that. Next slide. And we even have some faith-specific resources within our DV community. Faith Social Services is a Muslim-based social services organization that provides services to anyone in Fairfax County based on need and regardless of faith. But they specialize in working with the Muslim community and providing programs and trainings to imams and Muslim men and women about what the Quran says about domestic violence. And then Jakeda is an organization that is based on the Jewish faith, but they provide advocacy and services to any survivor, regardless of faith. They are actually based in Montgomery County, Maryland, but they also provide services here in Fairfax. They also provide specific education programs for Jewish teens and Jewish communities on dating violence and training and technical assistance to temples and rabbis. And you see their websites there for more information. All right, so now it's time for that knowledge check that I promised you. I think Caroline is going to drop, there she is, she's so fantastic. She's going to drop the link to the post-test into the chat. And if you prefer to scan it with a QR code on your phone, you can do that as well. So I'll give you just a few minutes to do that or to ask questions if you have them.
And while we're waiting, I just want to let everyone know, Brittany mentioned that Rabbi Amy used to be on the Council to End Domestic Violence, but we now have Reverend Dr. McBurrow on that committee.
We're very excited about that.
Yes, we are. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Brittany, thank you for in-depth. That was pretty in-depth to me. You said it was going to be a high-level overview, but it was pretty in-depth, so I appreciate it. Does anyone have any comments or any questions? And I know the focus was on the faith community and clergy, but we're all in relationships with people. So this applies too, if you're, if you're not a clergy, you're part of a house of worship, it applies just in our relationships with others that we may be around.
All right, so I won't go through the summary slides because I'm well over time and I want to give enough time for Casey and Amanda. Those are basically the answers to the survey. I want to just highlight, we do offer more training opportunities on this topic. They are not specifically focused on clergy, but it's kind of an overview of our coordinated community response here in Fairfax. We talk about we have a 2-hour session on all of the information that I covered around domestic violence. We take an hour to talk about domestic violence and the impact on children. We talk about the legal system. We talk about the criminal justice system. We talk about shelter. We talk about all sorts of stuff. And you'll probably get to see Casey and Amanda again as well. We do a lot of trainings together. So
Thank you,
happy
Brittany.
to share more information.
Now we will transition to Casey and Amanda for their presentation.
Great.
Casey and
Well,
Amanda.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for letting us be here. Again, my name is Amanda Paris. I'm a domestic violence detective with Fairfax County Police Department. I also have Casey with me, but I'll let her introduce herself.
Good evening, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm glad that we're able to talk to you guys a little bit and share some information. Fun fact about me is I saw that there's some people on here from Burke United Methodist Church, and almost 20 years ago, that's where my husband and I got married because I grew up in Burke Center. So, yay. Yeah. Next
Next slide, please. So you can keep clicking a few more times. There you go. So we're gonna kind of make sure that you guys understand the role of the police, what we do when we investigate domestic violence, talk about victims' rights and the roles of our victim services, and then kind of touch about that criminal justice process and what that looks like. You can go to the next slide, please. So kind of what is domestic violence? So domestic violence is assault and battery on a family member or household. That's the legal code that you see there, that 18.2-57.2. But it's any person who commits an assault and battery against a family member or household is guilty of a class 1 misdemeanor. So class 1 misdemeanor is up to a year in jail or a maximum of a $2,500 fine. And so you have that second kind of part of that code there, which basically says if they've been previously convicted of 2 offenses of against a felony or against a family member or household member, they're guilty of a class 6 felony. So no matter how serious the assault is, if they've had those 2 previous convicted offenses, anything after that will make it a felony.
And just really quickly, I think it's really important for us to distinguish between what we're talking about and kind of the overview that Brittany discussed, because domestic violence can be a lot of things. It can encapsulate many, many things, as Brittany shared with you all already. But the way that Virginia law is written, there's only certain things that the law enforcement officials within Virginia can do in order to arrest somebody for a domestic violence. So everything that Brittany just spoke about is 100% accurate, but there are some things that we kind of have to like drill down to and focus on when we're talking about what law enforcement can do to arrest somebody, prevent something, that type of thing. Okay.
You can go to the next slide. So when we talk about family or household member, you see that a lot in the law part of things. We talk about specific categories, right? So we have a spouse, a former spouse, you have parents or step-parents, children or stepchildren. You can keep clicking through for me. Brothers, sisters, half-brothers and half-sisters, grandparents and grandchildren, in-laws, but they have to reside together in the same home. Any children in common, and then cohabitants. And cohabitants can also be same-sex couples, but they have to have lived together within the past 12 months. So you see a lot of categories, but you also may probably see a lot of categories that are missing as well. And just for sake of time, you have aunts and uncles and cousins, right? You don't see those listed. So when I talk about things that are considered a covered relationship, this household and family member list is what I'm considering a a covered relationship. Yes, obviously aunts and uncles and cousins are all still considered part of your family. They're just not by Virginia law considered a covered relationship. Go ahead and click to the next slide. So kind of what happens after that 911 call, right? There might be a lot of people that you have that make that 911 call. It could be witnesses, it could be victims, it could be offenders themselves, it could be neighbors. We have children that call 911. It could really be anyone. But the call is dispatched by our dispatchers to patrol. So patrol officers arrive on scene. They kind of assess the situation. There'll be 2 officers that arrive to every domestic violence call, and they'll kind of assess what's going on, meaning do they need medical attention? Do we need to call an ambulance or anything like that? They'll conduct an investigation. They'll interview the victims. They'll interview suspects. They'll talk to witnesses. Depending on the age of the children, they'll also talk to the children as well. And then they have to find what we call probable cause that a predominant aggressor it has occurred in order for us to make that arrest for an assault. If they have that probable cause that there is a predominant aggressor, then arrest shall be made. And by Virginia law, it's actually a shall arrest. So we don't have a choice. So sometimes people think, they go ahead and they make that 911 phone call and all they want is just the abuse to stop for that night. And that's our goal, right? Our goal is obviously to help whoever we can, but our hands are tied. It's by law, we have to make an arrest. So when we get there, if we are interviewing everyone and we have, and I'll go into what a predominant aggressor is, but if we have probable cause, which means more likely than not that something has occurred, that an assault has occurred, we have to by law make an arrest.
And I think that's also important to note, historically, that was not the case, but our law changed back in the 90s to assist victims in cases where they didn't feel comfortable and they didn't feel safe to kind of raise the alarm bells that something was going on. So this kind of took it out of their hands and placed it in law enforcement's hands in order to make that decision for them. There's a lot of discussion that's still ongoing about how this can negatively affect somebody that's in a relationship when they do contact the police, and we're well aware of it. But I think that looking at what domestic violence looked like from a law enforcement perspective 25 to 30 years ago versus what it looks like now, as far as our ability to kind of get in there and assist and kind of help navigate some of that, it really has changed the dynamics to focus more on offender accountability versus the victim having to make that decision on her own.
Yeah. You can turn to the next slide. So you heard me talk about predominant aggressor, right? That we have that probable cause that a predominant aggressor has happened, that we have to make an arrest. So what is that predominant aggressor? So it's not the person that punches first or pushes first. It's not the primary aggressor. It's basically the person that puts that person or people in the most that causes that most serious threat. So it's the protection and health of safety of that family or household members. We're going to look at things that we look at are the prior complaints of family abuse. We're going to look at the severity of injuries. Is there someone that doesn't have any injuries and someone that has marks and bruising? We're also going to look at self-defense injuries as well. I had a case where I had a victim who was strangled and had no injuries, which is common in a strangulation. But then we had the offender that actually had scratch marks down their arm. And when we looked at that, we were able to determine that that was actually self-defense marks from the victim scratching at their arms to try and let them let go of them. So we definitely take into the severity and the totality of all those circumstances there. We're going to talk to witnesses, any observations, what does the scene look like? Are things thrown around or are things neatly placed together as well? So we take a look at kind of everything to figure out, who that predominant physical aggressor is. You can go to the next slide. So patrol officers are going to take care of the injuries. They're going to document the scene. They're going to take photos. They're going to collect any evidence. If a knife was used, they're going to go ahead and make sure that that knife was collected. They're going to take anything that they need. And then they're also going to administer what we call LAP. A LAP is lethality assessment program, which is a great tool that we use as well. And it's basically 11 different questions. It's scientifically based, and it's 11 different questions. So for example, is the other person jealous of you, or have they tried to harm you before? Different questions that kind of put them at a different level of harm, I would say. And then based off of that, if they need, can call on what we call in the lap line, which allows them to kind of get more assistance right then and there. So it's really great to help. It's a call into an advocate, but it also kind of helps screen in the danger and the lethality assessment of that victim. Casey, did you have anything else to add about the lap? Okay. Then what we do is we'll go ahead and we'll arrest that predominant aggressor, bring them before the magistrate. They'll set the bond and we'll have to issue an emergency protective order. We in Fairfax have to ask for an emergency protective order. And what that is it lasts for 72 hours to basically, it can be a wide range of things. It could mean that that person can't have any contact, that offender can't have any contact with that victim. Maybe they just can't have any assaultive contact with that person. So there's a wide range of different things that that protective order can have. We make sure that the victim is served with that copy as well as the offender, and they also get a victim's rights card, which Casey will be able to show you guys later. And then the officer writes the report and it kind of gives it to us as the domestic violence detectives, and we send it out to whoever is appropriate, whoever needs to hear it. So if there's kids involved, we're sending it out to the school resource officer. We're sending it out to CPS. We'll send it out to APS if we need to as well. You can go ahead and change the slide. So I think you can go back just once real quick. And so we talked a little bit, I'm just going to touch on this emergency protective order, but it says that we shall. So again, if we make that arrest, we'll also go ahead and make sure that we ask for that emergency protective order. And it'll be up to the magistrate to decide what the conditions are of that protective order. You can go ahead and change the slide. And so what we'll do is with that enforcement of that protective order, it is a civil process. So it is civil, but it can turn criminal when that protective order is violated. So for example, some possible violations that can occur is an assault. So while they're under that protective order, someone gets assaulted. Or if it says no contact and that person actually comes to that property, sometimes it says they have to be within 500 feet or 1,000 feet of that person's property or from that person at all. As soon as they have contact on a no contact protective order, that's a violation. It could even mean eye contact as well, or it could mean that, you know, I'm telling so-and-so, my friend, to contact Casey to tell Casey something for me. That's also a violation of that protective order as well. During a final protective order, they can't possess any firearms, and they'll be given a form to make sure that they fill out as well to know about that. And then we can either, there's new law that changed back in 2020, I believe, where we can either now charge that person violating that protective order, either where that protective order was issued or where the violation occurred. So for example, if someone got a protective order out in Fairfax County, but the violation actually occurred in Alex City, prior to that, we wouldn't be able to get a charge. We'd have to send them to Alexandria City Police to go ahead and obtain that charge. But now, because that protective order was issued here in Fairfax County, we can actually go ahead and get that charge that happened down in Alex City. And it really helps that victim so that they're not jumping from court to court to court, but we can centralize everything here because the protective order, they're already going to have to come to court for that. They're probably going to have to come to court for a criminal charge. So now that we can just always come to one courthouse.
And I just have to like echo what Amanda just said. I think that has been a gift that maybe we didn't even realize we needed as much as we did until it kind of started to put into practice. I'm currently working with a woman who does not live in Fairfax, and her offender does. And so there's several things that are happening outside of Fairfax jurisdiction, but I specifically asked her to get her protective order here in Fairfax because the felony assaults that happened to her here. And I knew that it would probably be easier in the long run for her to only have to go to one court and have one court jurisdiction be the one helping make the decisions about what should happen. And I think that's kind of what we're figuring out right now, that's probably going to be the best outcome in the long run. Somebody just put something in the chat.
Yeah, Casey and Amanda, Caroline and I have the same question. Is it only for Virginia jurisdictions where the violation can be charged? So if I do it in Fairfax, and then let's say I'm on family vacation in North Carolina, and my offender comes to North Carolina and does something, does that apply as well?
Yeah, so as long as that protective order has been issued here in Fairfax County, wherever that has occurred, we are able to go ahead and get that protective order violation.
Okay,
Good
thank
question.
you.
Yeah, great question. If we can slip to the next slide, please. So just a little bit about myself and my unit. We, in January, actually got moved to be a part of our Major Crimes Bureau. So we're located in headquarters. We do have a lieutenant and a sergeant that oversee us. There's 10 detectives that are currently in our unit, so that there's 8 that are assigned to each station. And then there's 2 other detectives that are kind of floater detectives. But we are the point of contact for anything when it comes to domestic violence as well as dating violence. Is kind of what we handle. We handle all felony types of cases and any cases that are come through our LAP line, which means if they're any time that an intimate partner, they make an arrest, they follow that LAP line protocol, they fill out that form, we get it, we'll follow up on those cases as well. We'll also follow up on the protective order violations, anything assigned by our supervisors. And sometimes we even kind of co-investigate cases with other MCB detectives. So for example, if while we're investigating a crime and a victim discloses that not only was there domestic violence, there was also sexual violence, we will work with our sex crimes detectives within our county to kind of co-investigate these cases. We'll even do that with child abuse as well. We've done that with exploitation, and a bunch of other entities that we can, that if the cases come up, that we'll go ahead and co-investigate with that. We are on an on-call status. So there's a detective that's on call 24/7 for the whole entire county. We do get called out to all intimate partner, dating, violence, strangulations. We'll get consulted for all of those in regards to felonies. We coordinate the fact exam. So a fact exam is where if you have someone that was strangled, they can go to what they call the fact department. It's either located in Fairfax Hospital, and they also have some satellite campuses as well throughout the county. But if someone was strangled, strangulation, and we could talk a whole day on strangulation. But when it comes time for strangulation, a lot of times there is no evidence, and the evidence is internal. And so if you were just strangled, I might not see marks, I might not see bruising, that might come up later or might not at all. But when you go to the fact department, it allows them to basically take that internal look, right? They're going to go ahead, they're going to look down their throat. They're going to look for something called petechiae, which is the popped blood vessels. I had a case where there was no marks or anything like at all. And they take a black light to the person's neck and you can see a full handprint on that neck. So if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have been able to really take that to court at all. So they're a great resource for us as well. They're also available. We're also available for patrol consultations. They call us all the time, all hours of the day, if they just have certain questions about any types of domestic violence cases. And I saw that Brittany posted what FACT stood for, so I appreciate it. Thank you. And then we also work really closely with victim services as well, just to ensure that the victim's needs and rights are taken care of. You can go ahead and switch to the next slide. Oh, you can go back just one real quick. So things that we do, we serve and we enforce those emergency protective orders, those preliminary protective orders. We'll serve and enforce any domestic assault warrants or anything related to domestic violence. If there's a protective order violation, let's say, we'll make sure that we are getting those certified copies of that protective order. If there's any prior convictions, meaning if we need to prove that this, they've been convicted twice before for an assault and battery, now we need to make this a felony, we'll go ahead and obtain those copies of those prior convictions when it comes time for court. And we also work closely with our Commonwealth attorneys as well to make sure that, we are bringing them the facts and the case as well for them to prosecute. We'll assist with that protective order process as well. Sometimes we attend the protective order hearings. Not only helps us when it comes time for court purposes, also helps us investigate, but also be there with that victim. We target repeat calls. It's unfortunate that we do have repeat calls, but we do have them in the county. We want to make sure that we are making sure that those victims are safe, especially when they are those repeat calls. And then we do training, whether that's within our actual own department or like this, to do public presentations to kind of educate as well partners within the county for domestic violence. I will take a quick second before Casey goes to see if anyone else has any questions so far.
And I'm sorry, I'm having some tech issues. Am I going forward or back?
Yes, you can go forward.
Okay, sorry.
No worries.
Okay, so on to me. So I'm going to be very cognizant of your time and that we have 4 minutes before 8:30 comes. So please know that I'm not going to go over your time because I I mean, it's Tuesday night and it's 8:30. What I can tell you is that our job is very important. What we do is a necessity, but I'm just going to encourage you guys to look at our slides and we'll keep on moving, okay? So we'll just go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. So I think what's important for me to make sure that I emphasize is that when you're a victim of a crime, you have certain rights that are available to you. And those rights include your ability to be heard at different levels of the court system, that you get informed of your rights in general, that you have the authorized services that are available to you, and that you are treated with dignity and respect, and that you have a right to privacy as we go through the court system as much as we possibly can. Next slide. So I'm going to kind of go out of order a little bit, and that's okay. So you can go forward one moment. That's probably easiest. So our Victim Services Division, we are a professional civilian staff within the police department. So we're not investigators. We're on call 24/7, 7 days a week. We go out with our major crimes detectives pretty much every day of the week, to be quite honest with you. If it's for strangulations, sexual assaults, homicides, malicious woundings, whatever it might be, we're going to be going out with our detectives to make sure that there's an advocate that's immediately meeting with the victim so that we can start building a rapport. We might not be giving them all the information at that particular point in time, but as long as they know who I am, I can get in touch with them the next day and say, hey, I'm Casey. Remember we met at the hospital, or we met at the FAC department, or we met at your house, or wherever that is. And so there's just like that automatic recognition of, this is a safe person. This is a person that's going to help me. I'm part of that team. We are part of the Major Crimes Division. So we are, not only are we at headquarters, which is by the government center, but we're also deployed at the different district stations as well. We work hand in hand with our domestic violence detectives, probably the most, and that's because on average, we handle about 3,500 cases of domestic violence where our detectives are looking at things throughout the year. And there's about 10,000 calls related to some sort of domestic violence issue within Fairfax County every year. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily criminal, but it's something that's happening. So suffice it to say, domestic violence is definitely kind of one of our biggest hitters when it comes to the crimes that our county is, and our police department is handling. There are 15 specialists and 1 director, and we do have a Spanish speaking unit. And I just want to kind of give a few accolades to that. I mean, that's a huge thing because we have a large immigrant community here in Fairfax County. And we would be doing them a disservice if we weren't trying to better ourselves as much as we possibly can every time, whatever that looks like. And for us, it's being able to have 3 dedicated specialists that are Spanish speaking to work with our Spanish population. We are Fairfax County Police Department, but we have memorandums of understanding with the other the other law enforcement agencies within Fairfax County. So that's the city, the towns of Herndon, Vienna. We work with George Mason Police Department and the Northern Virginia Community College. You can go to the next slide. Well, stay there. That's okay. You can go. So this is a trifold that I believe Amanda was the one that pointed out to you. This is something that's handed out to all victims of crime when they've been a victim of a violent crime. This is something that our officers are required to hand out, which basically gives them, in a nutshell, a little bit of information about their rights as a victim of a crime, as well as important numbers for them to know about community resources that are available to them. I know we're talking specifically about domestic violence here, but if it's a violent crime and it's happened in Fairfax County, our unit is involved in some capacity. You can move forward. I know we're at 8:30. So just a little bit about what we do. If we're not crawled out to the crime scene, we are getting a copy of that police report, and we can reach out to the victim the next day. Sometimes it's doing safety planning, it's explaining what protective orders are available to them. A lot of the things that we end up talking to them about is court preparation and explanation. Court is a very scary thing for most people, especially if they haven't been through it, or if it's something where they are now going to have to be a witness and have to start testifying. So it's our responsibility and our job to make sure that they understand as best as possible and help guide them through that whole process. We will do our best to attend and arrange meetings with our Commonwealth Attorney's Office. We will make sure that they can get to court if it's needed. We'll arrange transportation. We can assist victims of domestic violence if they need to go back to their house to get belongings, but their offender is still in the home and somehow the protective order does not allow them to be in the home without the offender. And we can arrange for a police officer to help escort them back. Our big thing is crisis intervention. We're meeting these people at probably the worst moments of their lives. We, by our nature, are not considered therapists, while some of us might have the degree for that. So our job is really to triage, to make sure that they have their basic and immediate needs met, and then we're going to give them out to the county of the different county resources that we do have, so that they can have appropriate resources available to them. We can assist them to make sure that they are aware when their offender does come, or excuse me, when their offender is released from jail through the VineLink system that our sheriff's department signs up for. Next slide. All right, I'm at 8:32. Really quickly, just so you know, as with the domestic violence detectives, the same thing goes with our other detectives. We work closely with them all the time. The good thing about them being up at headquarters, and a lot of us being up at headquarters, is that we see them on a daily basis. So it's not uncommon if one of us are in each other's cubes and talking about everything that's happening. I think that's kind of what we did most of today, to be quite honest with you, was talking about the calls that we had last night, was to make sure that we were all kind of on the same page and doing what we could for the victims that we were working with. Next.
Casey, really quickly, there's a question in the chat that says,
Sure.
Is there a way to get the VSD trifold?
Yeah, Susan, I can get you a trifold for sure. 100%. Any questions? I know I just ran through that in 6 minutes. And I could have spent an hour and a half on myself. So I apologize, but again, I wanted to make sure that we were honoring your time here tonight.
Does anyone have any questions or comments? I want to also thank Amanda and Casey for the awesome presentation. It was quick, but it was still helpful. I also want to remind everyone, Brittany spoke about it a little bit, but they do a training that's more in depth. If you get the Common Ground newsletter, you'll see it in there as a tier 1 training. Is that correct, Brittany?
Mm-hmm.
That you can feel free to sign up for. Caroline is going to put the survey in the chat for everyone to fill out regarding this presentation. We want to thank everyone for attending. We hope to see you next month, November 18th, for the last installment of our safety and security for this year. It'll be on emotional and mental health. And we look forward to seeing you all there. Does anyone have any last minute comments before we go? And are we able to send out the slides?
For us, yes.
Okay. Yeah, so we will be sending out the slides as well. Okay, well, thank you, everyone.